You think progress came from inventions, steam engines, electricity, vaccines? But one of the biggest leaps in human history came from something that killed a third of Europe, the Black Death. And what it left behind built the world you live in today. In 1347, ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. Most of the sailors on board were already dead. The ones still alive were covered in black, swollen lumps. Within days, the disease was in the city. Within a year, it was everywhere. Historians estimate it killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's entire population. In some towns, there was no one left to bury the dead. This should have been the end of everything. Instead, it rebuilt the entire structure of society from the ground up. Before the plague, most of Europe ran on one simple deal. Peasants worked the Lord's land. In exchange, they got protection and just enough to survive. They could not leave. They could not negotiate. There were always 10 more peasants ready to take their place. Then, in a few terrible years, a third of the workforce was gone. Suddenly, there were not 10 more peasants waiting. There were fields with no one to farm them, workshops with no one to run them. For the first time in centuries, labor was scarce. And when something is scarce, it becomes valuable. Peasants who survived realized they finally had something no lord could ignore: leverage. They demanded higher wages. Some simply walked away from their land and took work somewhere else that paid more. Landowners, desperate for workers, had no choice but to pay. Kings tried to stop it. England passed a law in 1351 freezing wages at pre-plague levels. Nobody followed it. There weren't enough enforcers left either. Wages kept climbing for decades. Historians now consider this one of the first times in European history ordinary workers had real bargaining power. The seed of something that would take 500 years to fully grow. The rise of paid labor, of workers' rights, of the idea that your work has a price you can negotiate. That seed was planted in a mass grave. But the plague changed more than money. It changed how people saw disease itself. Before this, sickness was mostly seen as punishment, a curse. God's will. But cities that survived multiple waves of plague started noticing patterns. The wealthy, who could leave the city when sickness arrived, survived more often. The poor, crowded into narrow streets with open sewage, died in far greater numbers. Officials in Italian cities like Venice started doing something no one had really tried before. They isolated incoming ships for 40 days before letting anyone ashore. The word for 40 in Italian is quaranta. That is where we get the word quarantine. This was the birth of public health. The idea that disease spreads through contact, that isolating the sick protects the healthy, that a city has a responsibility to manage outbreaks. None of that existed before the plague forced cities to figure it out or die trying. And it didn't stop at quarantine. Cities began building early sewage systems. They separated graveyards from wells. They created some of the first organized hospitals, not just places to die, but places built specifically to treat the sick. Every one of these ideas feels obvious now. Wash your hands. Isolate the sick. Workers deserve pay. None of it was obvious before millions of people had to die to prove it. The plague also cracked open something bigger. For 1,000 years, the church had explained almost everything: suffering, death, meaning. But when priests died at the same rate as everyone else, when prayer did nothing to stop the bodies piling up, people started asking a dangerous question. If prayer can't save us, what can? Historians point to this as one of the cracks that widened into the Renaissance. A shift toward observation, medicine, and human reason, instead of purely divine explanation. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed an entire way of explaining the world, and something new had to take its place. So the next time you get a paycheck, wash your hands before a meal, or trust a doctor over a priest to explain why you're sick, you're living inside an idea that was forged in mass graves across 14th century Europe. We don't build monuments to the Black Death. We don't put it on currency or teach it as an achievement. But in a strange, brutal way, it built more of the modern world than almost anything we do celebrate. Progress doesn't always come from someone inventing something new. Sometimes it comes from everything falling apart and humans having no choice but to build something better from what's left.